Okay, terrific. So those of you who have been with us before, you know the drill, and some of you are new. I really try to keep to the time. I have 15 minutes that I'm giving myself to present, and then we have at least 15 minutes to talk. And if some of you wish to stay on, sometimes we go the full hour, and there's always more to talk about. So welcome to Structure 1515, the series 2. We did series 1 last year, which was basically unpacking some of the components of international partnership programs. And now this series will really focus on balance. We have 7 set up from now until May, and each time we'll be talking about a different way to really think about balance in international partnership programs. And the first one is finding the sweet spot. So I'm Andrea Stumpf. I am kind of your host here, but it's a really collaborative effort, and I think we're really developing a community of practice, which is wonderful. And I'm a lawyer that worked at the World Bank for many years and saw maybe hundreds of these international partnership programs, and really am on a mission to show that it's a practice area and it's really worth thinking about the structure and understanding it and helping empower partners in their partnerships. So I will plunge right in. I have, let's see if this works from here. Okay, yep. So the first slide used to be my last slide. So in series 1, I would always show my books at the end. You know, you can always see more if you want. And I realized from a marketing perspective, that was a total fail. So I am now putting this as my first slide. These are the books. Most of the content that I present in the slides and the diagrams are from the books. My primer from a couple of years ago that lays out the components, and the book for builders that just came out this year, which is really more on the documents. I'd like to say more for the lawyers, but really anyone who's not afraid of documents. It has a charter in the middle with about 80 pages of annotated commentary on how to handle different clauses. But it also has a chapter on balance. And so most of these topics are taken from there. Now, also to set the stage, you know, the theme of the first book was like rock, like water, little flexibility, stability, different dualities. And the theme of the second book is it's all in the balance. So that's our series. The other way I'd like to frame this is to say that ultimately all of this, the books, the Structure 1515, all of this is about the question, ultimately, do you know where you are in the landscape? And of course, the idea behind that is that if you know where you are, you can see the options and hopefully make some good choices about how you want to proceed. And we're in international space, and we're talking about principally international partnership programs. So what I'm describing here can apply to lots of partnerships, but the structural piece is primarily centered around this, what I would say, special modality in the international community. So just a quick slide on definition, especially those of you who are new, so you know what modality we're talking about. International partnership programs, it's not a new label that I created, but I did try to create a definition so that we can actually understand structurally what this modality is. And the definition is this special combination of hybrid, old and new. So we start in international space, as I said, and then there are 2 basic components, and that's all it takes. If you have 2 things like this, then you are an international partnership program under the definition. You need an old piece, which is really the existing entity, the existing legal entity, which I call the supporting entity, which can support partnership elements. And then the new piece is the partnership reflected in a governing body. And if you have those 2, you're already there. Although, of course, in reality, most of these partnership programs also need to be funded. And so very typically, you'll also have a trust fund, 1 or more attached to it. So these trust-funded international partnership programs have these new elements, partnership elements, governing body, trust fund, attached to, supported by an existing entity. And of course, that existing entity can play multiple roles. It can be a secretariat, it can be a trustee. And another way to understand this is, you know, there's dozens, hundreds of these out there, but another way to see this is to see what it's not. So these international partnership programs are not like Gavi or the Green Climate Fund or EITI. like I said, a lot of what I say here applies to those, but they start structurally with a new legal entity, a dedicated legal entity that is created for that partnership, as opposed to getting the support from an existing entity. And when I say existing entity, I'm talking, for example, about the World Bank. So again, that's the basis of much of my experience. But UVA is with us. It could be UNICEF. It could be the Islamic Development Bank, other multilateral development organizations, UN organizations, international organizations that could provide this kind of support and essentially pitch this into international space as a result. All right, enough intro. I now want to do some slides, just a handful of slides on the sweet spot. And I'll take you through some ideas, some things to think about, some concepts. And then I'm really hoping at the end, I'll give you 2 examples that we have some time also to talk about examples and reflect on the importance of finding the sweet spot and creating balance through the sweet spot for these international partnership programs. So a couple of threshold considerations. My first is to say that it is itself a threshold consideration. So I would even go so far as to say that finding the sweet spot is a precondition for establishment of these partnership programs. And the other piece is that it's not just something you need upfront, but something that you want to maintain and nurture over time. It's really a life cycle condition for these sustained partnership programs. And you can think about it in a number of different ways. So the first way I want to lay it out for you is say that the sweet spot is essentially where the partners are able to converge and create collectives. I use the word collectives a lot. I like it. It's really where the partners collect their resources, their time, their energy, their focus, and create these partnership elements. So it could be a governing body or a trust fund, like what we described in the definition. And it's these collectives which will then enable you to have synergies. And of course, synergies is where you end up with the whole becoming greater than the sum of the parts. And if you don't have that, which is the whole point of partnering, then why would you partner, right? So you really, if you can do it better by yourself, then you should. But the partnering piece of it is for the synergies. And that really goes back to the ability to collectivize where you find a sweet spot. You can also think about the sweet spot in the context of perhaps the mindset where the partners are as a way to galvanize like-mindedness. So to the extent partners can find their sweet spot, they can be in a like-minded enough space that they can have consensus decision-making effectively, which of course allows you to make decisions about actions and gives you results-oriented partnering. So I would tie the sweet spot even to results-oriented partnering all the way back as a foundational piece for that. Now, if we wanted to drill down a little bit more and think about, okay, so what is this sweet spot? What do we mean by that? I think it's actually quite nice that the etymological origin of this phrase, the sweet spot, comes from sports. And it's really the idea that it's the place where you could get the best speed and control on a racket for maximum effect. And this results-oriented version, origin of the sweet spot fits very well with partnering because it's that overlap of interests and attitudes and goals that you're looking for to get maximum effect. And the best visual, I think you'll all agree, is a Venn diagram. Compliments of our 19th century English mathematician, John Venn. I don't know how we survive without Venn diagrams in our lives. But this is a diagram from my book for builders on page 56 for those of you who are reading along, where I discuss finding the sweet spot. All right, let's talk about it practically. What do you do with this sweet spot? How do you work through? How does this affect the life cycle of the partnership? So I would lay it out for you in kind of 3 phases. There's the motivations phase, incentives, and benefits. Motivations is really what the partners bring to the table. They're coming motivated to partner. And what's interesting about motivations is for all the collectives that we have in this partnering, motivations can differ, right? And they do differ. Like the public sector is going to be motivated very differently from the private sector coming in. And it's actually quite healthy to recognize that partners are coming from different places and appreciate those differences when they're coming into the partnership context. But so it's important to see motivations as being not so much about the commonality. You don't all have to be there for the same reasons, but it's about compatibility. Incentives, on the other hand, while everyone can have individualized incentives, incentives is where you can start thinking about partnership structure and design. And interestingly, try to think of building incentives into the structure and design that are collectively agreed. We'll talk about some examples of that in a moment. But incentives is really where the partnering has potential if partners are able to focus in on developing these collectively agreed incentives. And then finally, on the benefits, I guess my idea is that the incentives will reinforce participation, but the benefits will sustain it over time. And usually we think of, especially in the development space, we talk about benefits for beneficiaries, but it is actually quite as important and valid for the benefits to also accrue to the partners themselves. And if the partners themselves are not realizing some kind of benefit, even if it's just knowing that their funds were used properly, then it's really hard to sustain the partnership, and you'll probably lose at least your funders, if not more of your partners over time. So here's another visual. It's a diagram for my book. It's not one of my best, but I was trying to show this kind of life cycle, what happens when you join with motivations needing to match, when you engage over time, that incentives help make that work, and sustainment comes really through the benefits over time. And just a few quick examples. In the motivation space, upfront, as the partners are coming together, it's no coincidence that the middle of my book for builders is a big fat charter annotation section, because charters, I think, are very, very valuable vehicles in these partnership programs for example, testing the compatibility of the partners and making sure that the partners that there is enough of a sweet spot for these partners to come together. Incentives tend to be, as I said, are things that you can bring in structurally and can be very powerful for bringing in engagement of time and resources, keeping in mind, of course, that these partnerships are always voluntary. And if there isn't motivation and incentive, it's hard to keep partners engaged. So one example is governing body membership is very typically a way to get funders incentivized to participate. And some of you may even have seen that in action. And there are also partnerships that even set minimum thresholds for contributions. Now that can get quite complex, but it is a way to rally partners on board and to say, okay, we're dangling the membership here. If you give us a certain amount, or if you give us any amount, you'll be able to sit and be part of the decision-making. On the benefits, as I mentioned, it's really also valuable for the partners themselves to experience benefits over time. And here too, looking at funders' visibility and giving funders credit. Those of you who've worked in secretariats or with trust funds know that partners put a lot of stock into that. And so seeing those kinds of benefits will also help you have a more sustained partnership. All again, building on the sweet spot, which allowed everyone to come together. So I'm going to give two examples. They're pretty different, and I'm hoping that you'll also bring some different examples into the conversation. Some of you may be familiar with the GPSA, the Global Partnership for Social Accountability, which is still hosted by the World Bank and was created a number of years ago for the purpose of providing support, particularly to civil society organizations. And it's essentially a grant-making partnership, and it also has a lot of other knowledge and other aspects to it. But this is a case where the whole partnership, in terms of the grant making at least, was established on the basis of the sweet spot. And the mechanism to get there was to do essentially calls for proposals for the grants, And the grantees who would put their proposals forward, the prospective grantees, were essentially asked to present proposals around the sweet spot between them, civil society activities, and the government, the local government that they potentially could work with. And it was in finding that sweet spot, that was actually like one of the criterion of being able to get funding. This was a way that the World Bank was essentially, as a supporting entity, able to ensure a very constructive environment and avoid an antagonistic environment between civil society and government. And that was really important in a World Bank context where the World Bank's main client typically is the government. So it wasn't going to be really appropriate for the World Bank on the one hand to work with client governments, and on the other hand to put out grants that could be somehow create frictions. So by designing the call for proposals, competitive call for proposals around the sweet spot, we were able to actually establish a very good foundational basis for this partnership. And I think close to 40, I'm not sure of the current number now, countries signed up for this and also saw the benefit, and it proved very successful over time. I see I'm running tight on time here, so let me go through the next example. This is very different. It's a food safety public-private partnership. It's one that I'm working on right now. We've done the white paper, we've had a listening session. We are now talking to prospective partners and rallying them to the cause. And here what's interesting is that it's a combination of public, government, particularly US agencies right now, and private. So the idea is that we're talking about a platform to share data about capacity building for food safety. So that's a lot of verbiage, but the idea is that if you're going to train your producers and your processors for food safety, you want to make sure that the training actually works, that it's effective. So, Rasmus is on the call from IEG. The whole process of monitoring and evaluating is at the back end is critical to making sure that you're putting your money where it's useful and that you're getting what you need out of it. Here, the idea is that we need to share data from the public and private sectors among companies, and that we could, use that collective data platform as a way of being able to improve training for food safety. But the trick here, and this is my point on the sweet spot, is that the sweet spot is not as natural in this case. And that has a lot to do with the nature of the data and how the private sector feels about it. A lot of it is confidential, it's proprietary, and unless we actually create an environment in which not only everyone is motivated to participate, but the incentive is to participate because it's a safe space for the data, particularly on the private sector side, we will not have a partnership. So what I've been contributing as the lawyer, as the structure person, is to say we have to build this in from the beginning. This has to be a structural component. It's a threshold consideration. We can't say to people later, oh, we'll figure out that legal piece, stick with us and wait and see. No, it's actually got to be part of the entry package. And so we're looking at the legal protection zone, the way of handling this data as part of creating the sweet spot that will allow this partnership to go forward. So like I said, a different example on sweet spot, but again, it's a foundational piece to being able to have a sustained partnership. I just want to emphasize again that the sweet spot is not something that happens in the beginning and then you're done. You want to keep it and grow it. And I'm always a proponent of the incremental approach. And in this case, what we're talking about partly is building mutual respect around differing motivations. If the private sector is coming in for a very different reason from others, it's okay. We can respect each other's reasons for joining, but we also build a collective track record over time. And we're hopefully also building trust, all as ways to fortify and keep the balance. And my final slide, even though I know we're out of time for my 15 minutes, as a parent, I listen to Lisa D'Amour's podcast, and she always does this thing at the end that's called Parenting to Go. And it's just, to make you think about it as you leave. So I am really leaning on that. And here's my partnering to go for you. It's an excerpt from my book. I will read through it, but I think it summarizes what I've been trying to say here. Each partner can acknowledge and accommodate the interests of the other partners only as long as this does not undermine its own interest. And therein lies the balance. So again, balance. Putting this to the test early on, including through development of a partnership-wide charter that articulates this common ground on common terms, is an important confirmation of the partnership program's sweet spot. It is worth confirming from the start that the sweet spot is broad enough, so think inclusivity and stakeholders, and deep enough, think substance, to firmly ground the partnering effort over time. Thank you so much for listening to all of that. And we now have time for the conversation. I'm going to stop the share and then also just remind you that our next one on creating critical mass will be in a month on December 8th. And let's stop the share. Wonderful. All right. Thanks to all of you for joining, and floor is open. Love to hear if any of this resonated with you, if you have examples of sweet spots, if you have challenges where you can't find the sweet spot, please contribute. Thank you. I may have to call some names in a moment, but usually we have someone who's happy to lead.
Okay, I'll go because
you're the one.
Yes. What resonated actually was your last point, which was on the balance, and I'm thinking of the GAFS, the Global Agriculture and Food Security Program, where we had such diverse stakeholders with potentially quite divergent interests, but they did have a common interest, and rallying them around the outcomes was what allowed us to be able to continue to have productive conversations that ultimately the partners were able to say, well, all right, I'm prepared to leave off a little bit of this of my interest in service to that overall outcome. So that's the point that resonated with me, other than your entire presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe it's interesting because I kind of skip a little bit in jumping from motivations to incentives to benefits, because there is that piece that you're putting your finger on, which is, I think we'll call it compromise. Maybe we call it trade-offs. You know, collectives
exactly.
does require, maybe for some more than others, there are some costs to collectivizing. You have to give up some things, but you're doing it ideally in exchange for additional benefits that you wouldn't get otherwise. But surely that's part of bringing people together in the sweet spot, is to find that net balance, that net positive for each individual partner. Yeah, thank you.
Andrea, if I could jump in, I'm actually, Nicole already put the whole like-mindedness question on the table, which is something that I also think is very helpful in your latest work, because I think there was an assumption in many partnerships that you actually wanted to bring people, you know, or stakeholders with very diverse interests and to the table in order to resolve something. So if you only have the like-minded partners, sometimes you end up with a bit of a stalemate. You know, you get the same old like Nordics and Dutch on gender, or you know, some sort of like long-standing set of like-minded partners who have been working on an issue for a long time, but the others aren't really engaged. So I can think of several examples over the years where maybe the sweet spot got a little bit compressed because, or as you know, as Nicole said, it had to be moved away from upfront agreement to like a downstream results orientation. I'm thinking of things like, for example, like the World Commission on Dams, that's a really old one, going back to the 90s. Or, you know, just more recently, I remember Carbon Partnership had a bumpy road because, you know, you would go to, you had a whole group of stakeholders who were very much in favor of working on forestry, but then you came up against country managers who didn't want to deal with all the potential issues and downsides of forestry in a particular context, like, I don't know, Vietnam or a country where, this was of course, again, a long time ago, but a country where the risks would accrue a lot to the country manager, but not necessarily to the people financing interventions and plans and things like that. So I think the like-mindedness is also maybe a dividing line between when you move to like a more institutionalized structure with voting versus the consensus partnership structure that is so helpful in other cases.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I mean, first of all, your phrase, the compressed sweet spot, I think that's worth noting. And again, it's a very dynamic thing. You might start with a much wider sweet spot and then realize over time that actually the convergence is narrower than you thought, or maybe it does expand over time. You might be doing a pilot and you realize that the evidence is coming back positive, and then you're able to expand into other activities. The sweet spot gets larger on an evidence basis. But yeah, I think it fluctuates and it can sometimes get very compressed. My own experience is, and this is why I talk about like-mindedness a lot, is in this space, which is very voluntary and requires, I think, a high level of efficiency to be able to function well. And you're not in a corporate environment where you have other deadlines or factors converging in on you. It's actually could be pretty fluid, that those environments benefit from like-mindedness. The ability to not spend a lot of your time figuring out the disputes or the differences among you, but to zero in directly on the things that you have in common, and to use that supporting entity, hopefully very efficiently, to move that platform forward. That's not to say that you couldn't use this modality to also manage differences and maybe even disputes, and maybe some of you know some examples. And maybe the process of creating global public goods, for example, many of these partnerships create standards, like EITI basically set a standard and developed a whole process, certification process to go with it. So that surely took a lot of negotiating and a lot of effort. So there are certainly those examples, but the ones that I would say, looking at the World Bank or the multilaterals, the ones that may feel comfortable, particularly if you delegate a lot to the supporting entity, allow you to achieve a lot. And the ones that spend a lot of time trying to bring differing views together, maybe I'll point the finger at the Global Partnership for Education. It has a role as well, but what comes out at the end in terms of action is maybe not as rich, because you're also spending a lot of time reconciling different points of view. But it's also contextual, you just want to be sure that what the parties are there for is what you're actually able to achieve. I hope I'm stimulating some further thoughts here.
Yeah, I can come in, Andrea.
Yeah, Uwe.
Lots of thoughts being stimulated. I tried to kind of narrow it down a bit. I think your reference to GPE was good, because I was thinking about not being in the bank anymore, but with UNICEF, for example, about partnerships. How do you move from basically achieving a specific impact? And I think you had a good example, right? In some cases, it's quite clear if you have financial resources, and others like a trust fund, you probably aim to do things at country level. But then I think you made a good example earlier on, also maybe the partnership will focus on things like standard setting. I think that's kind of the point around not only finding the sweet spot, but also moving beyond the goodwill of those partners, having shared interests, coming together, but really to have something that actually makes sense. From where I sit right now, there's a lot of interest around specific topics, but in many cases, it has been discussions going on for years without really moving towards something that is meaningful or impactful. So I think that's an interesting point. I was wondering whether it does require funding, but I think your standard setting example is good, which basically doesn't necessarily mean you have to do things at country level or others, but you need to land on something where basically the partners coming together achieve something meaningful. It could be actually something like standard setting, or could be something like even advocacy, policy advocacy, and other topics. I think that's kind of the thought process I'm just in. Whether I was wondering whether we always need to have money at the table, but we probably don't.
Yeah, not at all. In fact, sometimes it's really healthy not to have too much money. You can get other things done. But I appreciate what you're saying, partly because it lets me amplify the importance of not just looking at the sweet spot itself, but the trajectory into incentives and benefits. Incentives in terms of how you're structuring things and how you can build those collectives with incentives that draw in the resources, the time and the energy. So your partnerships, potential partnerships where people are talking about things for a long time have apparently not made that jump into that incentivized structure that would get them engaged. And maybe one way to think about it, like the public-private partnership example I gave you, is what are the barriers to engagement right now? Why is it not such a priority? Is there something else that's keeping people from contributing? And then what's the incentive structure that would maybe break that logjam and create a positive dynamic? And then, of course, over time, as the benefits roll in, your standards are effectively approved and they're successfully implemented, then you have a nice feedback loop over time, which can also sustain the partnership. Have any of you seen cases where the sweet spot was there in the beginning and then seemed to disappear, or other things came into play and threatened it? Oh, great.
Thank you so much. As usually a great session. I think the big elephant in the room when we are talking about partnerships and the sweet spot is the private sector, isn't it?
Can be, yeah.
It can be. I think, yeah, especially when we are discussing the motivations and the incentives and the benefits. I think it's across the bank right now, the challenge to essentially balance up the potential input and impact that private sector can bring to the table. And as you and I have seen in several latest works with GFF, and I know that from with the GP you just mentioned, this balance is not always straightforward. I think that there is need for the bank to figure out a little bit more precisely the lengths which they are willing to go in order to let this partnership flourish in a sense where private sector and the bank and other partnerships and civil society and governments and everybody else can leverage on each other's comparative advantage a little bit more broadly and deeper, so to speak. So I think this is the biggest challenge going forward. And we're talking, of course, fundraising. It's about so many other aspects of the private sector's raw potential and existing, and how this can be developed in the future so that the bank goals are attained and those of the government.
Yeah,
So,
I think the private sector is definitely special in this context. I would be quick to distinguish between, say, private foundations, nonprofit sector, versus private companies that have a for-profit. So each one of those maybe has challenges. The for-profit piece of it, probably more challenging because, of course, the motivations can be divergent. And often, as I say in my books, deserve a second look to make sure that there really is that commonality that you're looking for. But I think in my experience, again, this space, international partnership programs, has proven particularly challenging in terms of bringing the private for-profit sector into the picture. There are a number of major private foundations, and at least those who know how to work with the sovereign bilaterals and multilaterals there's some that are very practiced at it, but the for-profit private sector is difficult. And when we look at things like climate change or even the pandemic, these partnerships with the private sector are extremely important. And the question might be, can we develop these international partnership program this particular modality in a way that is more engaging for the private sector. It's a stretch. I actually have not seen many cases where that has been effectively done. So we can think of a few. You may know of some yourselves. The Global Gas Flaring Reduction Initiative, the GGFR, which was really all about bringing private sector companies together, supported by the World Bank in this case, is one of the rare examples where I've seen that really been very effective and sustained over a number of years. But it definitely brings in a different dynamic that is worth looking at more closely, and where, as I mentioned in the prior example, the incentive structure, the design, probably needs a little bit of shifting to make sure that it's all properly accommodated. And I see Rasmus in the chat saying that the IFC has several. Yeah, absolutely, because they are, of course, much closer to the private sector. And there's probably a lot of learning for other less private sector oriented multilaterals to think about how those structures are set up, that you probably know more about than we do. I know we're past time, and I'm happy to keep going. And any of you who need to leave, please also feel free to drop off. But Rasmus, would you be able to speak a bit to the IFC experience with the private sector in this space, and how they are able to design and structure to amplify the sweet spot?
No, I actually don't really know how they do it. But there is something that's sort of like there's something on banking sector, for example, and it's sort of like handed over. They've sort of handed it over, so it sort of gets run by private sector companies, and then they alternate. And this is both that one I'm thinking of and several others. It's a lot about standard setting, where private sector actors see value in having standards around social and environmental sustainability, or reporting, impact-based reporting, and things of that sort. And the industry realizes the benefit to them of coming together and having joint shared standards, norms, and so on and so forth, right? And they need a convener. They need somebody to bring them together and help give knowledge and credibility and the secretariat and so on and so forth to make the collaboration happen.
And these are probably ones that don't rely specifically on trust-funded programs, where the downstream implementation is not collectivized through the supporting entity, but maybe is something that is then everyone individually does it, or as you say, it may be handed to another entity to help that implementation support. I can think of Handshep. I don't remember what it exactly stands for, but it was Armin Fiedler's favorite partnership, precisely because it wasn't an implementation vehicle. It was basically donors coming together that convened for the purpose of sharing their experience in the health space, looking at certain aspects. And each of them were implementing their own grants. So they weren't trying to collectivize that piece of it, but there's a community of practice effectively on what worked and what didn't work, and how they could leverage each other's experience and coordinate downstream in country environments. And he thought that was so effective because it had, no big trust fund attached to it. It didn't need a big secretariat. It was time and resources, but it was very collaborative, and they definitely had a sweet spot and were achieving a lot in terms of their respective efforts, convening around certain understandings or experiences. And there are other good examples that don't get a lot of visibility because they don't have all the funds flowing through them, but these sweet spots are really the way they begin, and then create this kind of common output. When we're talking about standards, I always like to use the term global public goods to go with it, because that's in some ways what legitimizes the standard setting from a international development perspective. You may be doing something that's really commercially beneficial and the private sector has an interest in it, but you're also creating a global public good in many of these cases, where it also helps beneficiaries, it helps kind of the planet, or it helps the citizenry or consumers. So for example, this public-private partnership and capacity building data sharing, I would expect that around that you end up also creating a certain framework about how that training would work, which in and of itself is an output that is valuable for the partnership, this kind of global public good. Yeah, any other thoughts?
Just that topic on the private sector, I mean, I have no doubt you could spin multiple sessions out of it.
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's there are you know, I mean, I continue to live through, you know, a number of those issues. I mean, I think you know, on the trust fund side and on the fifth side, you know, at the bank, you know, I think you know, the point of this session about, you know, the sweet spot, I think something you mentioned about GGFR, you know, resonated, right? If we're thinking about, you know, what's the sweet spot in the context of this private sector discussion, right? I think there are some vehicles that have been specifically designed around that type of idea, and gas flaring, you know, is probably the best and easiest example, right? Where the whole intent, I think, I mean, I wasn't around at the time, but my understanding is, you know, the whole intent was to draw
Yes.
a number of these actors in, right? So that, as you said, you know, the incentives, right, and the understanding of who the partners would be and what the intent was kind of clear up front. And I think that's different than, you know, what we experience with some of our existing, you know, partnerships, trust funds, and FIFs, where you have, you know, upfront kind of a traditional, you know, group of partners, and then you're trying to bolt onto that, you know, some private sector just because, you know, we want to do some financial gap filling, right?
Yeah.
And the implications for that in terms of the reputation and, you know, the bank's, you know, role as a, you know, as an honest broker, et cetera, are very different in those scenarios. So I just think that the, you know, the discussion of the sweet spot, you know, for private sector engagement is an interesting thing to think about. How do you get there, and what are the right, maybe not every situation, you know,
Lends itself
calls
to a
for the
sweet
same-
spot. Yeah.
And there may be better and different ways to engage with the private sector within a particular space than trying to, you know, get a small trickle of money that allows them to then, you know, have outsized influence in governance, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's even appropriate to be wary of this private sector. I don't mean to overstate that, but I can go back to an example from many years ago, the Africa stockpiles. Jane, do you remember that one? That was a partnership which had an ambitious and very laudable goal. It wanted to deal with all the chemical deposits that were left behind on various sites in African settings. And the idea was to make the chemical companies themselves, the private sector partners in this venture, essentially recognizing their responsibility in having left a lot of these piles and encouraging them to participate. At the time, the idea was into an escrow account, an escrow fund, which would help finance some of these cleanup activities. And it was a very difficult effort. We were working through a trade association, or, you know, an association representing these chemical companies at the time. We had pretty long and drawn out negotiations, a lot of ambition, a lot of talk. And then in the end, we didn't manage to pull money together. And part of the problem was that the chemical companies, I mean, they had a lot of terms and conditions that were difficult for us to agree with, that, you know, had to do with liability and some things that we couldn't even help them with. So it was hard for them to see the benefit without, you know, giving the funds without seeing something come out at their end. And there was little that we could offer in return. But what really became challenging is that some of these partners started putting out press releases about how they were engaged and what amounts of money they were contributing and things that they were doing at a time when they hadn't actually contributed anything yet. And of course, we had a code of conduct, like a protocol that said, you need to get our permission before you can start using the name of the partnership in your press releases. Well, you know, it kind of fell apart even from that perspective, that it was clear that these chemical companies were much more interested in their reputations and the visibility they were getting from this partnership than actually contributing. And in the end, I think the idea just didn't go anywhere. So that was a case where, you know, we could have worked harder to build the sweet spot, but maybe there just wasn't one that really fit this space, and that we needed other mechanisms or other ways to get private sector companies to contribute to the chemical residue that they left all over different sites in Africa. Let's see, there's some stuff in the
Yeah,
chat.
Andrea,
Yeah.
Andrea, that also reminds me of the Goldman Sachs 1,000 Women Partnership,
Oh, yes,
which
tell
was
us.
the subject of, you know, so many meetings at the working level. You know, how could we find a appropriate structure for this that maintained the bank's independence and didn't make it look like we were in the pocket of Goldman Sachs. This was like in the early 2010s, so right after the financial crisis, and you know, we were concerned about reputational risk, and some of these conversations in the bank just become forever circular. And in the meantime, somebody agreed that the president of the World Bank could have a photo op about the partnership with the head of the foundation, of the Goldman Sachs Foundation. And, you know, so it was like we lost any kind of leverage on, you know, holding out, well, you know, we'd love for you to have that visibility for the partnership because you are actually contributing money. You know, anyway, some of these things, I don't know if there's any sweet spot, that they're just like, you know, there's never going to be a good way to do them. And
Jane,
you know, I thought that
interestingly, I'm so sorry. I was just going to say, interestingly, I saw that the IFC actually ended up doing
Yeah, they
something
did.
with them. So
Yeah.
they found a way. I'm not sure what it was. Yeah, I cut you off. Sorry.
Oh, no, no problem. I do think IFC is much better at evaluating these risks, because I think their staff are more comfortable looking at companies and assessing where the, you know, the pros and cons lie in terms of an association. And so, you know, we always had this problem that the bank staff, like somebody in the health sector, and they're approached by a corporation to want to partner, they don't really have the skill set to take apart that company and decide, make a case to management that this is a perfectly safe company to associate with. And, you know, I hear that, you know, guidelines are still being developed now, and, you know, in the trust fund team in the bank, but you know, it has always been much easier for IFC to make those judgments, and they don't have the procurement side of it where, you know, there's going to be like a, you know, some procurement from that company later on, and everybody's going to say, oh, well, they got the inside track because of this partnership. So I think IFC is just better at this.
Actually, since you mentioned procurement, that's of course one of the major obstacles to getting the private sector involved in trust fund governance, you know, and the partnership elements of it, is that as soon as they are part of the upstream governance, part of the governing body for these trust funds, they, under our current procurement rules at the World Bank and perhaps other places, they essentially disqualify themselves from being eligible for bidding for certain activities downstream. So there's a, procurement sees a very direct relationship. And if you go to the conflicts of interest session that we did in the first series and think about, you know, potential synergies, I think there is a very narrow view on procurement that doesn't really accommodate much of a partnership perspective. And that partnership voice is missing in those conversations. So my point when we talked about that last spring was that you at least should have the partnership voice in there and think about whether there are reasonable limits or not. I'll just give the quick example of the energy storage partnership. I'm not exactly sure what they're up to now, but they had ambitions to really engage the private sector as part of the collaborative, you know, partnership space. And from procurement perspective, they ended up not including the private sector, even though they were convening around private sector activities, which is essentially, you know, battery research and creating better recyclable energy sources. It just proved very difficult under procurement rules to set up something that was going to allow the private sector to sit at the same table. So, yeah.
Just a couple quick reactions to that in case it's of use to folks, because I unfortunately live this reality in multiple, wearing multiple hats with multiple clients every day. Number one, everyone sees these issues differently, right? So even within the institution, you have a huge variance in risk tolerance between individuals, managers, senior managers, functions, et cetera. And I'm not saying that that's wrong, right? I mean, I think that's natural, right? People have different levels of comfort with different types of engagement, you know, given their background. What I think that points to, though, is a need to have some sort of, you know, centralized, you know, yes, it leads to bureaucratic swirl, as the kids say, right? But it does, to me, point the need for some sort of centralized review process, right? So that the only decision maker isn't the team who's obviously going to benefit from the money coming in, right? There has to be some balance in that perspective, because it just, you know, I've seen this time and time again. And frankly, I've seen it even from a program management team that turns over, and the new program management team says, what on earth are these private sector donors doing here? They're dominating the governance, they're dominating the discussion. You know, why on earth are they in here, when the previous program management team fought tooth and nail, you know, very aggressively, you know, to bring those donors in, right? So ensuring some balance in perspectives, you know, beyond the folks who will, you know, rightly or wrongly be kind of seen internally to be the beneficiaries of this private sector money, I think is important and healthy, because of the nature of the risks that you're weighing, right? It's you know, there's narrow technical things like procurement, and then broader things that are a bit, you know, less tangible, like reputational risk. The second thing is, you know, we've found it broadly helpful to think about things in two ways. You know, so what we call kind of like upstream risks and downstream risks, right? So upstream risk, that's what we were talking about in governance, like the role in governance, the perceptions about the role in governance, the perceptions or reality of inside information, you know, information in advance, information about, you know, the pipeline. Is there a sense of exclusivity? You know, that those types of things that could arguably be mitigated to a certain extent by looking at governance rules, right? But then there's a second set of issues that Andrea was just mentioning about, you know, what we think of as downstream risks, right? That in the World Bank context, at least, there's a risk that certain types of private interests will very obviously have business interests downstream, whether in the form of procurement or otherwise. And our trust fund, you know, policy colleagues in DFI take the view, right, that the trust fund policy says, you know, no, you know, benefits, unfair advantages, et cetera. And that means that they're not supposed to be leveraging their contribution and then getting procurement downstream of that trust fund. And actually managing those risks is really difficult when you dig into it, right? You know, rightly or wrongly, we don't always have the tools to know exactly what's going on, particularly when you think about large organizations. So at any rate, we found it helpful to think about them in those two buckets, some of which are a little bit easier to mitigate than others.
So super helpful, Paul. Thank you. It's always great to get your input, because that is like in the trenches, and the issues that you've raised. It's also really great of you to share how you have addressed them, you know, not just the problem, but also maybe not the full solution, but at least ways to think about them and to manage them, which is really helpful. And I think this upstream downstream split is also really interesting, and kind of, it's a structural piece, right? We can take the structure, and it's not just one big conglomerate partnership. There are aspects that are upstream, there are aspects that are downstream, and we can think about them in somewhat more nuanced ways. Yeah, so that's actually really helpful, I think. I think we're just about at the hour. So I don't know if you have any closing thoughts, but I would really encourage you to come back and invite others when we talk again about critical mass, which has, you know, many other elements to it, and all of these will overlap and converge over time, but we'll have more to say in a month on all of this. Thank you so much to everyone. For those of you in the US, happy Thanksgiving in the meantime, and wishing everybody else a good rest of November. We'll see each other then, hopefully in December. Thank you. Bye-bye.